Welcome to this lecture, which deals with the theory of interest. The title is Further Considerations in the Theory of Interest. We will deal with certain aspects of this theory and go into a little bit more depth as compared to the previous lectures. In my introductory lecture, I stressed that one of the particularities of Austrian economic analysis is the conception that prices steer markets, prices steer investment decisions. And this point has been stressed also by subsequent speakers. Before we start now, it is important to consider the fact that it is strictly speaking not prices that steer markets, but incomes that steer markets. It is not the intention of an entrepreneur to sell his product necessarily at the highest price that he could get for the price. In that case, very often, he should go for just the one buyer who would pay him the highest price. For example, I might go to the market and say, well, who is the one buyer who is ready to pay the highest price for a lecture of mine, and I would find somebody who maybe pays, whatever, $50,000. It's very unlikely to find such a person, but he might be there. So if I go then to the market and say, I sell my services at $50,000 per hour, I would get very few buyers. I would thus have a life income of $50,000, which is a very unsatisfactory situation, given the purchasing power of the dollar. So the point is not necessarily to sell at the highest price, but to maximize income. Income is the result of price and quantity sold. I'm better off if I sell my lectures at $1,000 per hour and I sell 100 or 1,000 of them, because then my income is correspondingly higher. It's more satisfactory to have a lifetime income of $1 million, although this is not very much given the dollar's purchasing power, than $50,000. Okay, so we need to look at how incomes are being formed and at the different types of incomes that exist in a free market, and which steer the selection of investment projects and which steer the allocation of capital and of labor. We will therefore, in my lecture, first deal with two main points. The first one is the definition of interest, and we will, in particular, analyze in more detail the difference between interest on the one hand, or pure interest on the one hand, and profit and loss on the other hand. And then we will, in a second step, discuss different theories of pure interest, most notably the theories by Schumpeter, the time preference theory held by the Austrian school, and other conceptions. Okay, so let's start off by the definition of pure interest. The most easy way to go about this is to consider the basic financial structure of any investment project. An investment project, like human action in general, is stretched out in time, so we have here a timeline, and we can distinguish 2 points of time, a previous point of time, T1, and a later point of time, T2. It's one of my favorite diagrams, very simple, very primitive, and it allows us to discuss important principles. So we have here an investment project, which could be a financial investment, but also an industrial investment. I pay initially 100 units of money, which could be 100 euros or $100,000, which is roughly speaking the same thing. Right? And I have subsequently, at point of time to T2, I have an income of 120 units of money. Again, 120 euros, $120,000, 120 million yens. That is of little importance because, as we have already seen, what is important is the relationship between these two figures, not the absolute amount that is being paid. So we call this second figure here, we call it the revenue of the firm. It's the gross revenue of the firm. And this first figure is the cost expenditure. Not to be confused with subjective cost or opportunity cost. Every action has an opportunity cost. You being here is the opportunity cost of not enjoying the nice warm weather outside, the Alabama sun, and the songs sung by Alabamians and so on. So we have gross revenue, cost expenditure, and the difference between the two is then a sum that we can observe on the market. We can identify it with the accounting procedures of a company, and we might call it by different names. Sometimes it is called gross profit or net revenue, and I will call it gross surplus. So this is the gross surplus of the company. So 120 minus 10 equals 20. So this is the starting point of economic analysis. It's something that we can observe. Now, what economic analysis does for us is to decompose this sum, the gross surplus, into different components. And the different components distinguish themselves by the different causes that are here at work. And there are different factors that come into play and that make that the gross revenue is 20 units higher than my cost expenditure. And again, there are different ways to analyze this, but mainly speaking, we find in the literature the following four components. We have on the one hand a pure interest, which is the subject of our lecture, which is the point that we need to analyze in more detail. Then we have a price premium, a risk premium, and we have profit and loss. So these are the four components. They have different causes. The price premium is sometimes called the inflation premium. It is that part of the surplus that results from the desire of the investor to counterbalance a loss of the purchasing power of the money unit. So the investor, for example, might anticipate an inflation rate of 5%. So rather than losing his money, he wants to preserve the purchasing power of his initial investment. So therefore, when he invests, he requires that there be at least 5% of a difference between his initial investment and the return that he eventually gets out of this investment. The risk premium is similarly a compensation for the risk incurred in an investment. Now, usually what is meant here by the risk premium is the compensation for quantifiable risk. You remember the distinction between risk and uncertainty that Professor Klein has discussed. So we are here typically speaking about risk in the Knightian sense, that is a quantifiable risk. There are different types of risk. Right? Fundamentally, there is political risk and there are different types of market risk. Political risk results from political interventionism into the market. So in many cases, this is the most important chunk of risk. Right? Especially it's a big plague for investment in developing countries. Political risk is typically high, because you have people like, Saddam Hussein is dead, but Hugo Chavez and other political geniuses who make investment in their countries a nightmare. So if anybody invests in such countries, he requires that there be an enormous return on investment to compensate him for the probability that he be expropriated by the political genius at the helm of the government. So, as you might imagine, then this reduces the amount of money that is being invested in such countries, and that's the reason why countries with bandits at the helmet tend to be poor, because there's not much capital being invested. But there are other types of risk, and there's the macroeconomic risks that, again, sometimes are at the borderline of political risk. Macroeconomic risks are most notably created, at any rate from an Austrian point of view, by central bank intervention, right, which create business cycles and so on. Macroeconomic risk can also result from the geographical position of a country, which is more liable to certain natural geographical climate influences and so on. And then finally, there are risks pertaining to the management of different companies or different markets. For example, the food market is typically less risky than the market for antiquarian furniture. Right? It's much more risky because the tastes are changing more rapidly and so on. And finally, we have profit and loss, which again is something that we will talk now in more detail. So, according to the Austrians, the cause of pure interest, as the conventional Austrian theory, is time preference. One reason why investors require that their investment yields a gross revenue that is higher than the initial investment is that they prefer to keep their money in their hand. So if they are being asked to exchange $100 now against some sum in the future, some revenue in the future, they require that the sum in the future be higher because they have a time preference. So we have three causes. Inflation, risk, and time preference are three different causes that contribute to there being a spread between the initial investment and the eventual return. Profit and loss is a particular story. Profit and loss result from error, from economic error. And we will analyze this in more detail. So in the case, it's most obvious in the case of loss. And if you overestimate the amount of money that you can earn with a certain investment, and you spend 100 units of money now and eventually earn only 105 or something, which is below the inflation rate, then you have lost purchasing power of your investment. So you have incurred a loss. Now, excuse me? This? Okay. Right, so the logic of the investment, so how can we say what does it mean that we say the investor requires this sort of a return? What possibility has he to steer this? Well, the answer is, of course, he cannot influence this sum here. Right? He cannot influence the final sum for which he will sell his product. This is determined by his customer. Either the consumer, in the case that he produces a final consumer good, or the corporate customers who will buy from him if he produces a producer good. So this sum here he cannot change, as is an objective given. It's an objective given even though at the moment when he invests he does not know it. It's something that is yet unknown, it's something that lies in the future. But still it does not depend on his will, it depends on the will of the other guys, of his customers. So when we say that he requires a certain spread between this sum and this, it can only mean that the entrepreneur can influence this sum here. Right? He can influence the sum that he spends in investment. For example, he can say, I will invest in producing such pens, which I count selling for 120 units of money in the future. I will buy them only if I can buy all the factors of production that are needed to produce them. All the labor, all the raw materials, the production facilities, and so on. If I can buy everything that I need to make these pens that I reckon to sell for 120 units, if I can buy them for 120. In that sense only, an entrepreneur can require that his investment yield a certain minimum. Because he has the choice either to make the investment or not to make the investment. This is a choice that he alone makes. And so he can say either I get at least this spread as compared to what I expect to be the final selling receipts, or I don't invest at all. So in this sense, can we say that he requires a compensation for the loss of purchasing power, so the price premium? In this sense, can we say that he requires a compensation for the risk that he incurs? And in the same sense, we can also say that he requires a compensation for his time preference. He does not require a profit or a loss. This is something that, again, depends on the quality of his choice in making the investment, so which brings us to our next subject. Now we will now deal with the difference between pure interest and profit and loss by discussing a concrete example. So consider the following example, where we have two investments, A and B. A is the production of orange juice. B is the production of pens. Two completely different products, heterogeneous from the point of view of their physical characteristics. In investing in A, we have to invest 105 units of money and we earn a gross revenue of 110. In the case of B, we have to invest 95, we earn a gross revenue of 130. So clearly B is the better deal, right? In the case of B, we have a return on investment that is higher than 35%. In the case of A, we have a return on investment that is lower than 5%. Now clearly, B is, if we say that A and B are the only investments that we can make in our economy, then B, the entrepreneur invests in B, earns a profit, he earns much more than, not only than A, but he also earns much more than he could have earned if he had made a different investment. And this is the point that we have to grasp now. Right? That if he had made a different choice, if he had spent less on the production of B, but more if he had entered the A business, if A had spent less on the entrepreneur involved in the production of A had spent less on this project but had entered the B business, then the figures might have been very different. What happens if we enter a business we are active on the two markets, or two types of markets, on the factor markets and on the product markets. All right, so we have here our investment project with the 2 points of time. At point of time to T1, we buy factors of production, and we have so here an aggregate representation of the factors of production, the markets for the factors of production. And, excuse me? Oh yeah. Like this? Okay. Factors. All right. Oh yeah, right. There's a zoom function. All right. So. Okay. So we have this. So if we invest more in a market, it always means that we increase the demand for the factors of production needed for that type of product. And it means that in the future we increase the supply of the good that is being sold on the market. Okay? Now the increase of the demand entails an increase of cost, and this increase of cost tends not to be proportional but over proportional. Right? This brings us a little bit into cost theory. I will not make this. I will explain to you this in more detail if you ask me in the question and answer period. Right? But the point is, so this increase here in cost is over proportional. It tends to be over proportional. On the other hand, there is an increase of the supply in the future, so the price drops, and the price too tends to drop over proportional. There are some exceptions, so there again that we could consider. But let's say, for example, it can be that in a company, a slight increase of the size of the company would entail a relative drop of costs and would entail a relative increase of the revenue that you can create with the company. This can be the case. But there is always a limit to this process, right? You cannot indefinitely increase the revenue of a company by simply investing more in that company. All the while you diminish the costs indefinitely. If this were the case, I mean, this would imply that, for example, that customers are just crazy for your product. For example, I'm offering my pens, and people are just crazy for the pens. I'm producing more of the pens. They're ready to pay any price for the pens and spend any amount of money on the pens. They no longer go on holidays. They live under bridges, right? They sell their houses and so on because they want to have my pens. Right? And then finally they starve, but the last penny they spend on my pens and so on, right? I mean, but even then, right, there's only a limited amount of money that you can earn this way. So ultimately, you always get to a situation in which the costs rise over proportionally and the revenue diminishes, or, well, it might increase, but increases under proportionally. Now this, the reverse is true, of course, as well, right? If we take money out of a business, we are moving back from the red curve to the black curve. It is in this way we are reducing costs. We sooner or later get to a situation in which costs diminish over proportionally. We're moving here also from the red supply to the black supply. So there again we have a reduction of income. But the reduction of income at some point becomes over-proportional. So what does this mean for our initial example? If we now turn back to the A and B case, it means that if we had taken out money out of the A project and put it into the B project, right, to benefit from the higher return on investment, and we would, for example, have reduced our investment here from 105 to 80, and our revenue would have fallen from 110 to 96. What you see in these figures is that so both the cost and the revenue diminish, but the cost, according to what I've explained to you before, falls quicker, falls stronger than the revenue. Okay, so this is the typical situation that we would expect in the long run for any such project. And in the case of B, we might do the opposite. We might increase our cost expenditure to 120 and obtain a revenue of 144. So we see here again, right, that both cost and revenue increase, but costs increase stronger than the revenue, which is, again, is the typical result. So why have I chosen those figures? The figures in red, I've chosen them because they represent a situation that economists call general equilibrium. It's a situation in which exactly the same return is earned in both A and B. And you earn 96 on an 80 investment in the A project, which means that you have earned a 20% return on investment. And because you have now 16 gross surplus on an investment of 80, so this is 16 is 80, 20% of 80. And in the B project, you have earned a gross surplus of 144 minus 120, so 24, on an investment of 120, so it's also 20%. Now, the point of choosing these figures is to construe a case in which no further arbitrage would be possible, because what we have considered here is a movement of arbitrage. Right? This flash here is an arbitrage. We take capital out of one line of business, for example, out of the production of orange juice, where we earn a relatively low return, and we put this money into some other business, the production of pens or wheelchairs or whatever. And so we get finally to a situation in which the return on investment is exactly the same in both cases. This return, which subsists in such a situation of general equilibrium, this return we call the pure interest rate. Okay? If we make abstraction from risk premia and inflation premia.
Which one was the pure interest?
In our example here, the pure interest would be 20%. Right? It's that interest rate that obtains, or that return on investment that obtains in a situation of general equilibrium and is the same in all lines of business, in every single investment project. As compared to this situation, to this hypothetical situation of general equilibrium, which in practice never exists, but which possibly could exist. So it's a realistic reference point. As compared to this situation, we can now define profit and loss in our present example. We would have earned a 20% return on investment in general equilibrium, but in the first case, we have here earned less than 5%. So which means that our entrepreneur has in fact lost more than 15%. Okay? And in the B case, where we had an investment of 95 and earned 35, so a return of more than 35%, he had a 15% pure profit. Okay? So that's the way we can define profit and loss. We can define it only by reference to a situation of general equilibrium. And in this situation of general equilibrium, no further arbitrage is possible. Every investor has made a perfect investment. He could not have made a better investment by going somewhere else. So there's no error in such a situation. As compared to this situation, in the case given here in black, the person investing in A has made an error. He could have invested elsewhere. He could have invested in B. He did not do so. Why? Well, because, of course, he probably did not expect that the revenue in A would only be 110, whereas the revenue in B would be 130. Right? Otherwise, he would not have done it. So, he who incurs a loss makes a loss because he has erred himself. Himself has made an investment error. What about the person who realizes a pure profit? What about the person who has invested in the B project? Well, he did not make an error himself. Right? Rather, he made a profit because other people were making mistakes in their investment decisions. So a pure loss is always due to the error of the investor himself. A pure profit is always due to the error made by other people. Because nobody came into our line of business to compete with us. So this is a very simple setting. Of course, we can make it more complicated by considering, for example, that certain lines of business have psychological attraction for the investor. For example, it's more psychologically satisfying often to work, for example, in a theater company than in a steel mill. Okay? Theater company of all these very educated and funny people. In the steel mill, you have the guys who are sweating and swearing and so on, yeah. And, violent often, yeah. So, right, so you might actually prefer to work at a lower revenue in a theater company rather than work at a higher revenue in a steel company. And that is also exactly what we observe in practice. Right? A lot of volunteering going on in theater companies, very few volunteers in steel mills. Right? So these are complications. Other complication would be legal barriers. Some lines of business are protected by law. You cannot enter. As a consequence, higher returns on investment are earned in such lines of business and cannot be competed away, cannot be arbitraged away. So that has nothing to do with pure interest, has nothing to do with profit and loss. That is a political rent. It's an additional income category. So we'll neglect this here. So we have here our distinction between pure interest on the one hand, profit and loss on the other hand. And this whole process of arbitrage is, of course, of central importance for the understanding of the operation of a market economy, because it holds true in principle for the relationship between any two investments. As I've said, right? My example was here orange juice and pens, right? Two products which are physically completely dissimilar. So competition from an Austrian point of view not only holds for physically similar products, is the point that Professor Di Lorenzo has also stressed, but includes all products on the market. All processes, all firms are competing with one another because all firms are vying for consumer expenditure. And all firms need ultimately the same factors of production. All firms need capital, all firms need labor. So it's a competition process that involves all of the market economy. Now, let us turn to the second part of the lecture and raise the question, why is it, and this is the question that Professor Murphy has also raised, why is it that this arbitrage process does not also cover the pure interest rate? Why does it stop here? Why is there not somebody who just bids up the prices for the factors of production? Further, for example, the factors of production needed in the A process so that their price goes up to 96, so that we pay 96 here to earn 96 later on. We could bid up the prices for the factors needed in process B to 144. Of course, you know already that the Austrian answer to this time preference, but I'll discuss with you other explanations of this and also give you some critique of the time preference theory of interest. So what are the main factors, the main theories? I mean, there are of course various theories that explain pure interest, or the Austrian pure time preference theory is one of those theories. I will discuss in the time that remains the following four theories, the one of Schumpeter, then the productivity theory, which Professor Murphy has already covered to some extent, then come to the time preference theory, and finally to the means-ends theory of interest. So we'll start with Schumpeter. Schumpeter is interesting because Schumpeter belongs precisely to those who deny that in general equilibrium there be any spread between selling receipts and cost expenditure at all. In other words, Schumpeter believes that in general equilibrium the interest rate would be zero. There is no such thing as pure interest. Entrepreneurs would bid up all the factor prices until they are exactly equal to the revenue that they gain with the help of those factors. Schumpeter is just the most brilliant economist who has come up with this theory or similar theory. There were others that were a little less brilliant, but it shows also that, well, Schumpeter was maybe not quite as brilliant as some believe. Because the fundamental flaw in this theory, and it is one that has been discussed long before Schumpeter, is that at a zero interest rate, there is no more incentive for market participants to make savings for others. There's one piece of empirical evidence that leads some credence to Schumpeter's theory, and this is the saving behavior of households. Household savings do not depend, statistically, econometrically, on the interest rate, right? There is a correlation of about 1% between variations in savings and variations of the interest rate, which is negligible. And of course, this is not, for Austrians, such a empirical finding is always a starting point that calls for an explanation. It is not an explanation or an answer. But in this case, it's pretty obvious what the explanation of this fact is. And the fact is that households make their savings essentially to prepare for the future, and prepare for retirement, prepare for the purchase of a house, of a family residence, prepare for paying for the education of their children, and so on. And irrespective of how much the interest rate is, I want my children to go to the university, so I have to set aside a certain sum of money, and so the sum of money that I set aside does not depend at all on the interest rate. But we cannot jump from this fact to the generalization that all saving is independent of the interest rate. All saving is independent of the amount of money that we are being paid for being savers. There is a division of labor in savings, a division of labor that we have already discussed. Some people are good savers. They are good at leading a frugal lifestyle. Other people are less good at this. Right? So, why should those who are good at leading a frugal lifestyle, why should they make savings and put them at the disposition of others? Well, because they are getting paid for this. It's like any other form of the division of labor. In any single case, we are producing those things at which we are particularly good in excess of our proper needs, of our own needs. The pen producer produces millions of those pens. How many of them will he use himself? One. Right? So he produces them in excess of his proper needs for others. He's getting paid for this. That's why he produces so many of them. I'm giving lectures. I don't need any more lectures on things that I know about. So I wouldn't have to give lectures to myself. I give lectures to others because at the Mises Institute they pay me millions of dollars for this. And so the saver saves in excess of his own needs because it's a source of revenue for him. So in other words, Schumpeter's theory presupposes that as the interest rate drops to zero, the economy would just continue as before. The economy with the level of capital investment that has been reached would continue just as before. But this is, of course, a ludicrous assumption. Right? That part of saving that occurs only because savers are rewarded by putting their savings at the disposition of others would fall away. So the economy would shrink. It's not possible that a stationary economy, a general equilibrium economy, could occur at a zero interest rate. And this, by the way, has been stressed in a very interesting debate between Frédéric Bastiat and Joseph Proudhon. Proudhon is a socialist, anarcho-communist. In France, Bastiat, a French classical liberal. And so they had this debate on the nature of interest and of banking in an exchange that took place in the revolutionary year of 1848. So those of you who read French should have a look at this. All the texts are online. And those who do not read French but English should be happy because very soon there will be an English edition of this, published by the Liberty Fund. Okay, the next theory is the one discussed already by Professor Murphy, so I'll be very brief. It's the productivity theory of interest. According to this theory, it's the productivity of physical factors of production that creates a monetary surplus. Now, this theory is difficult to illustrate because in most cases the product is on a physical level dissimilar to the factors of production that are being used. I produce a car. In the car I have various ingredients, steel, rubber, and cloth, and so on. And the car is dissimilar to the ingredients that I've used. So how can I say, how far can I say that the car is more than those ingredients? There was also labor involved. A more easy case is rice production. So typically what you get in illustrations of this theory is the production of rice. Right? So rice production, you plant 1 ton of rice now and you get 21 tons after a couple of months. So we have here physical productivity, and this physical productivity is held to explain the monetary surplus generated by rice production. Now, let's abstract from the fact that in the production process, we not only have rice, but also human labor. So strictly speaking, we have 2 different ingredients. So it's difficult, again, to say, is labor plus rice, is this more or less, right? 1 ton of 1 ton of rice, seed, plus labor now, is this more or less than 21 tons of rice in the future? It's also a little bit like comparing apples and oranges. We cannot make a clear statement. But let's forget about this. Let's just consider the rice figures. Right? But then, as Professor Murphy has explained, the difficulty here is that we abstract from market pricing. Right? There's no reason why the prices in the future should be exactly the same as the prices that exist right now. Right now, a ton of rice might sell for $1,000, right? But it might be that prices drop very significantly, maybe to half or something like this. And in this case, selling 21 tons, well, would still give us a profit, but okay, prices might drop to whatever, $20 per ton. And in this case, we would no longer make a profit on this rice production. All right, so the theory presupposes what it wants to explain, namely why there be a monetary surplus. The Austrian theory explains pure interest with the concept of time preference. So all market participants prefer present consumption to future consumption. They prefer a present good of a certain type to a future good of the same type. I prefer $100 now to $100 later. So in order to induce me to give up $100 now, one has to offer me more than $100 in the future. This extra that is needed to entice me to give up my $100 now, this is the interest rate. It's the interest. Now, in the Austrian school, we have at least two different conceptions. That is, more than this, but two conceptions that I will discuss. The one by boehm-bawerk and the other one by Mises. Boehm-bawerk's conception is a psychological one. So boehm-bawerk says, we prefer a good now to exactly the same good in the future. And he gives us various reasons for this. One is that we tend to underestimate the need that we will have of such goods in the future, whereas we tend to overestimate the need of such goods in the present. So we only give them up at a premium. He also gives a technological explanation for this. He says, well, the more roundabout processes are more physically productive, and so this leads us back to the productivity theory, so we'll neglect this. The problem with boehm-bawerk's approach, a problem that has been underlined by Mises, is that is not a psychological, it's not a praxeological theory, it's a psychological theory. And the idea of praxeology is to have economic laws or identify economic laws that hold true at all times in all places. Now, time preference, according to boehm-bawerk, does not exist necessarily at all times and at all places. It might be that for the psychological reasons that he enumerated, people prefer present goods to future goods. But it might also be that in other circumstances, they would not. Or they might be the other way around, that they prefer future goods to present goods. If it's just a matter of psychological disposition, psychological dispositions can change, for example, also under the impact of political fashions and so on. So you might actually get a negative time preference, not a positive time preference. So this creates, of course, a difficulty for the general conception that Mises had of economic science, which is a science of universal laws. Something might be such and such under one set of circumstances and completely different under another set of circumstances, contingent circumstances, then you don't have an economic law, a universal concept. So what is Mises' way out? He has a different conception of time preference, a praxeological conception of time preference. According to Mises, the very fact that I buy something shows that I want to benefit from the services of this good sooner rather than later. And this cannot possibly be otherwise, which is true. You are attending this lecture, want to obtain my lecturer services sooner rather than later, because you could also watch the show tomorrow or so when it's online, or next year or whenever, sooner rather than later. So you demonstrate that you have a time preference. You prefer benefiting from this good sooner rather than later. I buy a sandwich, I eat my sandwich, etc., etc. Whatever we do, in each single case, we demonstrate that we have such a time preference. The problem with Mises' conception, so Mises gets around the difficulties that we saw in boehm-bawerk's conception, but Mises' own conception is not without difficulty either. In particular, although time preference is a necessary fact as defined by Mises, it does not necessarily give us an explanation of the phenomenon that we want to explain, namely the spread between future prices and present prices, or future payment stream and a present payment stream. So we consider again our numerical example. How would Mises explain this? Well, he would say that by paying 100 units for the factors of production now, I demonstrate that I prefer benefiting from their services sooner rather than later. Then I produce my product. I sell it on the market for 120 units. And again, by selling them for 120, I demonstrate that I want to have the 120 sooner rather than later. Again, demonstrate my time preference. Okay. But let's say now we take a different example. We take the following. So here we have no interest. There's no yield on investment, no return on investment. But we can still apply Mises' reasoning. You could say, well, by selling now for 100, I still demonstrate that I want to have these 100 units sooner rather than later. So his theory still holds, but it doesn't explain what we are supposed to explain, namely the difference between selling receipts and cost expenditure. And we still can apply it if we have this spending stream. We invest 100 and we get 80 out of them. Right? In both cases, we demonstrate our time preference. I buy the factors of production for 100, demonstrate my time preference. And later on, I sell for 80. Again, demonstrate my time preference for the sum of 80 units of money. You see the difficulty? Right? So even though Mises has a universalist conception of time preference, this conception of time preference does not explain to us why there should ever be a positive spread between selling receipts and cost expenditure. It's a difficulty. So in a paper that I published in 2004 2002 in the Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics with the title A Theory of Interest. So I present this argument in much more detail and criticize the time preference theory and develop or try to develop an alternative conception. And this alternative conception is based on the following idea, or the following fact. It's based on the fact that in any human action, we employ means in order to attain certain ends. Now, what can we say about the value relationship between means and ends? It is clear that means can never be equal in value to the ends that they are supposed to serve. Right? Means, by their very nature, must have a lower value than the ends that they serve. Okay? So here then we have, in distinct contrast to Mises' conception, we have a theory that relates the value of the means that we mobilize to the value of the ends that we want to attain. Now, this does not give us in all cases a positive spread between payment schemes. For example, here again, consider the following case. I spend 100 units of money now, I sell a product for 80. Does this necessarily mean that the means that I use are less valuable than the ends that I attain? Not necessarily. For example, in the case of a charitable donation or of a charitable hospital or something like this, we typically spend more on the factors of production than we earn as a revenue. And still, the total package that we obtain here at the end, that is certain services that we want to be delivered plus certain revenue, is still considered, in our eyes, to be more important than the means that we mobilize, that is the 100 units of money that we spend, and so on. Right? Also think, for example, of non-profit organizations such as the Mises Institute. Right? So typically, right, you get a similar situation. They have a certain revenue, but the revenue is less than the amount of money that they spend as a total. Right? So they are dependent on additional donations and so on from people outside, sponsors, in order to keep up their operations. And still, right, the ends that are being reached are more important in value, in subjective value, than the means that have been mobilized. Now, for a particular subset of human action, that is for investors on a market economy, right, the purpose of investing, by definition, is to earn a monetary revenue. In the case of such people who act in order to gain monetary revenue, then clearly the amount of money that we hope to gain must be higher than the amount of money that we spend on the factors of production. And so then here, given their purpose, namely earning money, and a higher money income always has a higher value than the initial cost of expenditure. So the theory still applies, right? And we can therefore explain interest rates as a particular case of this general law according to which the means that we use always need to have or always have a lower subjective value than the ends that we want to attain. Okay, so we have in our lecture defined in more detail interest, pure interest, by distinguishing it from profit and loss. We've discussed various theories of interest and their advantages and disadvantages. And if I were to, well, give you in one sentence a statement on the implications of our considerations here, I should say that they demonstrate the importance of fundamental research, right? Even in our day, we cannot just rely completely on Karl Menger, on Mises, on Rothbard, and build up from there. It's important that there also be new people looking into fundamental concepts and also revising them, and always having a critical look on them and revise them. And so I've tried to do this in my 2002 paper. There are a couple of younger people doing the same thing right now, also in this field and in others. And this is ultimately what will keep the whole discussion of fundamental laws alive, and it will keep praxeology alive, because it should be a living science and not some museum of concepts. Thank you. I don't know how are we doing time-wise? Do we have? When is the lecture supposed to end? 45. Okay. We have time for 2 or 3 questions. Yeah. Okay, please.
Yeah, if you could put up that A and B diagram again. I just had a question about. You mentioned. Okay, so I understand. So the profit margin is greater in B, and so the guy who was doing A wants to move to D.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay. Mm-hmm. So you mentioned something about one guy suffering a loss and the other profiting, and I wasn't quite sure about what you were talking about.
So we have you see. Do you see that I use different colors here, right?
Right.
Yeah. So in the first case, in the case of the black figures, A suffered a loss relative to what he could have earned if he had made no investment error. Right? That's the crucial point.
But in absolute terms, he was profiting.
Excuse me?
But in absolute terms, he was still.
Yeah, so we have here an interesting case, right? This is a case that we call a case of accounting profits. He is still in excess of revenue as compared to cost expenditure, but not of economic profit. Right? So it's the difference between accounting profit and economic profit. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
When you were discussing that the increase in the factor prices tends to be over proportional and the decrease tends to be proportional in the product prices.
Yeah.
Is that, could you explain that if you have a moment, or maybe after, or is that because of something to do with diminishing returns, although that wouldn't always be the case, or the fact that with the factor prices...
Yeah, well, it will take me more than 1 minute, so therefore I prefer explaining this. Yeah. Do we have one other question? Yeah. Yep. You?
My question concerns your revision of the means theory of business, the means ends.
Yeah.
I remember that means implies human action. Human action is removing helpful easiness and is exchanging words or like substituting the worst situation for a better situation. And he sees that really the means and relationship as an exchange. So isn't like the means and
Well, I mean, there's really no contradiction here, right? I mean, in the case of, from the means ends framework, which is exactly Mises' framework too, right? He also stresses this as a category. Of course, we use means that have a relatively lower value in order to obtain a higher value. I mean, from a psychological point of view, of course, this means that we are better off. And we're exchanging something that has a lower value against something that has a higher value. In fact, the theory even applies not only to interest, right, so capital investment, it also applies to any market exchange. If you go to a bakery and you buy bread for $1, then the dollar is your means to obtain the bread. Why do you give the dollar for the bread? Well, because it has a lower value. Right, so in fact, one interesting implication of the means ends theory is that it unifies price theory with interest theory.
You spoke of a profit and loss category inside of the general equilibrium idea there. How is it possible that there can be profit and loss in general equilibrium?
Or in general equilibrium, there is no economic profit and no economic loss. There's only accounting profit. Right? Thank you. Okay, we'll stop here. Take our questions.